So have we got Phillies fans out there? Hopefully, maybe a few. Are you impressed that we had 3 of our 4 infielders make the All-Star team? Hey, it's pretty impressive. I mean, Phillies haven't done that in many decades. Since we'll test how old some of you are. Trio and Rose and Schmidt and Boa. How could I forget Larry Boa? Anyway, it's pretty impressive, and it speaks to their ability, their persistence. It speaks to the team, and it's a good thing to celebrate. Now, as Philadelphians, we are also hoping that we will be celebrating in October, because let's be honest, nobody aspires to finish in the middle of the pack. No one says, "Cool, I was just kind of hoping to come in third," or no one says, "I'm cool with last. It works for me. It's fun. We're just playing the game." You probably shouldn't be playing it professionally. And that's all well and good. We all want to be winners, and we have a habit of maybe wanting to be champions, or maybe even the greatest of all time, or the GOAT, as it's come to be called. And we can have some fun talking about which team, pick a sport, might be the GOAT, or which players. I mean, you'll hear like Tom Brady's name tossed around as the GOAT. We could talk and we could have some fun. But, focusing on being the greatest isn't always the best way to live. And, every time I hear that GOAT bit, it brings Matthew 25 to mind, which is the parable of the sheep and the goats. When God says to the sheep, "Come into my presence," and to the goats, "See you later." So I'm kind of thinking it may not be all that great to be a goat in God's economy, just saying there. Not that I have to worry about being the goat in the current sense. I do worry a little about being a goat in the parable sense. But that's okay, because God's economy isn't a greatest economy, because, God took care of that part. God's the goat, and the rest of us are his creatures. And both of our passages this morning have something to say about strength and also about weakness and God's perspective. So when I looked at the passages for this week, the one thing that really jumped at me this time, and I have to say it's jumped before, is the part where God tells Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." Try telling that one to the Phillies. But this is what God is telling Paul. And this is very much against the whole GOAT, G-O-A-T caps, perspective. And Paul could boast. Well, let's be true. Paul could actually say some things. Look at the number of churches that he founded and all the revelations that he received and insights. The message to the Gentiles was really hugely effective. And he mentored tons of future leaders. If anyone could really make a claim for the early church all-star team, Paul really had it down. Though if you read around in 2 Corinthians, you'll see there were other people who put up another perspective that maybe they were, but we won't go there today. But Paul had a right to boast, and he says that. He said, I could boast it. I wouldn't be that big a stretch if I boasted on what I've done. But, he says, and this is an interesting thing, and this one jumped at me more this time than other times I've read it. Paul says, "I refrain from doing it, so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me." Let me read that again. "I refrain from boasting, so that no one may think better of me than what is seen in me or heard from me." So think about it for a minute. What matters is who we are and how we live our daily lives, not what we or anybody else says about us. So what do people see when they watch us just doing the stuff that we do? What do they see in us? Do they see Jesus in us? And what do people hear from our mouths? Words of grace or words of judgment? Do our words bring hope? What do people hear from us? Do our words help people see Jesus? It's a pretty good acid test in some ways. to kind of check in with what we're doing. It's not what anyone says or what we say. It's what we do and who we are. But then Paul moves on into his main point, and he talks about a thorn that has come. And we don't know what that thorn in the flesh was. And yes, this is where that colloquial phrase, I have a thorn in the flesh. This is where it comes from. This is the source. And we don't know what the thorn is, and that's probably helpful. People have guessed on a bunch of stuff, and there's some pretty good arguments for some of them. But I think it's best that we don't know, because then we can kind of substitute the thorns that relate to us. And we can adapt to that. We don't think, well, I didn't have that. Paul was, talking about this one thing. No, it's thorns. And think about it. I can see thorny thoughts coming from you at the moment, because we all have thorns in our lives. We all have things that are hard. Maybe it's an illness or a disability, a family situation, a work situation, a lack of work situation. You name it. There's thorns everywhere in our lives. But Paul has some insights about thorns. But at first, we have to say, Paul doesn't flat out accept the thorn he's given. He doesn't. He doesn't say, this is my thorn. He checks in with God first. It's like, God, I've got this thorn. Could you do something about it? And he does it 3 times. And sometimes God says, yeah, we need to work on getting rid of that thorn. Here, let me help you with that. Because sometimes we're responsible for the thorn. We might have nurtured it, accidentally planted seeds for it, all sorts of stuff. And it can be fixed. So don't assume flat out, I'm stuck with this thorn. But if God says, no, that's the way it's going to be, this is your thorn, then it doesn't mean that God didn't hear you. It doesn't mean that you've done something wrong. None of those things. It's a way for God's strength to be shown more clearly. Now that makes your thorn look a little bit more warm and fuzzy. Well, maybe at least some of the time. Because here is Paul's key point. God's grace is sufficient for us, for power is made perfect in weakness. Okay, so we're going to pick this apart a little bit because it's a pretty incredible statement. And if you took it out on the street, people might look at you like you were a little bit crazy. But this is not a new thing for God. Paul didn't come with this great insight from the bolt from the blue on this one particular thing. We have a whole list of people who have been weak that God has used in powerful ways. Moses, the stutterer, who was also a fugitive. Joseph, the younger brother who ended up in prison in Egypt. David, the younger son, out tending the sheep. Mary, a young woman from a small town. Peter, a fisherman. God specializes, when we look at it, in using those who are weak, who don't have a lot of power, the unexpected. It's God's thing. And Paul actually broke this pattern in a lot of ways, because he was a Roman citizen, a student of the Torah. He got a reputation. When the stoning of Stephen came, and he stood there holding everybody's coats, people were like, oh, that Paul, he's an up-and-coming guy. So he had sort of a name. And then he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and everything changed for him. But he still was kind of one of those people that stuck out. I don't think Paul was a wallflower. I think if Paul was in the room, you knew Paul was in the room. And that's a good thing. But he would definitely have made the church all-star team. But the thorn reminded Paul of 2 essential truths. There are 2 things that we need. And the first is God's grace. And we toss grace around a lot. And I'm not always sure we think about all that grace means. Grace is God's unmerited love for us. God's undeserved actions on our behalf. The biggest and most noteworthy being his gift of Jesus and Jesus' death on the cross for our salvation while we were still sinners. God didn't say, if you guys shape up and do all these things, then I will send my son. Nope. We were failing pretty bad. And God sent Jesus. Undeserved actions of God on our behalf. Grace is a gift. It is not earned. And we have a tendency to focus on earned things, what we've earned, what other people have earned, or what they haven't earned, and what we deserve and what they deserve. And yeah, grace isn't that. Grace just throws that out of the equation. Grace is God's undeserved gift to us. And in that, the focus is on God and God's power, not necessarily on us. But think about what grace means. Grace isn't just a get-out-of-hell-free card kind of thing, which sometimes we think of that. Grace has a lot of things to offer. Think about what happens if you are living in grace. A world of grace is a world of hope, because all things are possible in God's grace. It's freedom from fear. We don't have to always be worried about doing the wrong thing. It's freedom to fail, and it's okay. God may say, try this new thing, and you fall flat on your face, and in grace, that's fine. Maybe not in that counting deserved and earned equation, but that's not the equation. We have the freedom to fail. We have security. We have encouragement. We have the confidence to do all sorts of stuff. All those excuses, And we have a vision that comes with that, or we should, of having grace shared to everybody freely as God's gift. So grace is a pretty cool thing, and I encourage you to give some thought, because I just scratched the surface, about what grace means when we let it in our lives, when we live a life of grace for ourselves, and share a life of grace with those around us. And then Paul talks about the other key thing, and that's God's power. And that's pretty interesting. Another thing, do you think about what God's power is and what that means? God's power is, of course, maybe we'll think right off, the power of creation. Sun, planets, stars, comets, mountains, deserts, rivers, all those kind of big flashy things, thunder, lightning, volcanoes, glaciers. That's God's power, right? Oh, yeah, I'll agree with you, definitely. But there's another aspect, and I've called it God's power of creativity. Because think a bit about all the incredible richness of what God has done. And the creativity, think of sunsets and rainbows and waterfalls. Think of all the different kinds of plants. We have crabgrass and giant redwoods, cucumbers and wheat, sunflowers and dandelions. I could go on. That's the power of creativity that is with God. We have bears and chipmunks, sea turtles, eagles, giraffes, and we even have bunnies. And then, of course, we have us. Just take a second and look around the sanctuary and look at the diversity of God's creation. And some of us know each other really well, and we can list strengths and we can just do that. And weaknesses, because we know each other. We've been together a while. We don't always know, but there's an incredible wealth of gifts and talents and abilities and backgrounds, all those things. That's all part of God's creativity. And that is part of God's power. We don't think of creativity in that way of being power, but it is. God's power is also the power of knowledge and understanding. God's power and understanding, which God does share with us. God knows how everything works. Like all those things in science class, and some of the things the scientists haven't even begun to figure out yet. God knows what goes on in the very bottom of the ocean and why. And God understands the creatures God made, from bunnies to sea turtles to chipmunks. And God understands us because God made us. God knows us, each one of us, every last one of you, and everyone out there and all over, because God made all of us. God knows our strengths and our weaknesses, the things that we want to do really well, the things that we're trying to dodge and avoid, all those things. God knows us. And that understanding and knowledge is part of God's power. Think about that. And finally, there is the power of endurance. God is the one who was and is to come, as Revelation tells us. And there is strength and great power in that solid endurance. So God's power isn't just thunder and lightning and that kind of stuff. God's power is on all different levels, and it is quite a force to be reckoned with. I, for one, do not want to stand against it. And then Scripture tells us that all that power is made perfect in our weakness. Okay. Because that's when we kind of, that old adage, let go and let God. But there's truth in that. Of letting God do God's stuff, working through us. Not just throwing us aside and saying, oh, I can do that better, which God could. But God chooses to work through us. And God works best when we're uncertain, when we have stuff to learn and to grow in, and when we're confused or when we're scared, or when we have a thorn, whatever that thorn might be. But the thorns kind of force us to look at our own limitations as the creature, not the creator. And that opens the door to the Creator's power. And this, when it works well, can really capture the attention of people out there. Because they'll be, whoa, I never expected that. Didn't see that one coming. Look at that. Listen, look at those words of grace. Wow, that makes a difference. There's an impact there. And yet, for all of that, Paul reminds us that the thorns are still there. You know, they hang in there, and then the last bit in verse 10, you know, Paul says, you know, there's all this stuff that, you know, I am content with. Though I'm going to come back to that. I think it's really content despite. But he lists weakness, insults, hardships, persecution, calamities. That stuff doesn't all go away. It's not like, oh, God's power and everything's cool. No, it's not. There will always be conflict between God and God's ways and the ways of the world. And when we think of content, I don't think it means that we're thinking, oh, that's cool, it's okay. Or I'll just pretend it's not there. I think when Paul says content, he's talking about a confidence and a peace inside himself in that situation. That he can be in the midst of the insults, the hardship, the persecution, all those things. And he can say, to quote the hymn, it is well with my soul. You know, I'm okay, I am secure in God's grace, so that I can live productively in the midst of these very interesting, confusing, challenging, disruptive, etc. situations. I am content, not because I've just accepted and said, oh well, thrown up my hands, can't change it. No. I'm content because I know that I am living in God's grace and that God is with me, and that is an internal contentment despite the stuff that is around us. And we all know those things too, the stuff that goes on and the stuff that we think we're doing the right thing and it just doesn't, it's still there. But when we are acting on behalf of Christ and looking toward the kingdom of Christ, God's with us. And despite all that stuff, Christ's work will be done. And that work will bear fruit. And I just had a flash to the parable of the sower and the seed and all those good seeds growing really well. And Mark's passage picks some of this up. The first part just kind of reminds us, and it's a good thing in a sermon for another day, that our disbelief can really hinder what God's doing. But that's another sermon, unless you want to spend the rest of your day here. Didn't think so. But the second part of Mark's passage picks up on the theme of God's work through weakness. So you're going to send out your very first batch, kind of missionaries, to do your work. Who are you going to pick? Well, Jesus chose not scholars, not orators, not people with big reputations. He chose fishermen, a former tax collector, like a bunch of everyday people. And he sends them out to bring God's word, to tell people, I need you to repent, and to do miracles. Jesus sent the disciples out to do miracles. And I'm telling you, they must have said, well, okay, Jesus, but I'm relying on you to do this, because this is way out of my league. And that's exactly where Jesus needed them to be, because they were real out of their league. And Jesus also told them that when you do this, there'll be thorns. There's going to be people who just don't want to hear what you have to say. You're going to run into some conflict. And Jesus said, just shake it off. Now, that may be familiar to some in a different context, but Jesus said it first. Shake it off. Just get rid of that, all the dust on your feet, and move on. Because there are going to be thorns. But God's power is going with you, and those that will hear it will be changed. And if we read a little bit further in Mark, then we'll find out that, the disciples came back and said, wow, Jesus, you were right. Some of the hard stuff happened, but people repented. People heard us. We healed. This was amazing. And they learned a lot about God's power and their trust in it. So where does that leave us this morning? First off, as I said before, God's the goat, G-O-A-T, all caps, and we're just the sheep, and that is a very good thing. And second, we shouldn't just accept those thorns. We should check in with God to see if maybe we need to weed out some thorns in our lives, that there are things that can be fixed. But when God says no, it doesn't mean that we've failed or that God doesn't love us. It just gives us an opportunity to let God work through that weakness. This also means we don't have a lot of excuses. But I can't do fill in the blank. I could never. I mean, in some cases, like I say, I could never sing, but I guess maybe I could, but don't worry, I won't. But there's all sorts of things that we can't do. But guess what? God doesn't care that we say we can't do it, because God can do it. And if God calls us to do it, and God has not called me to sing that I know of, but if he did, then he would give me that ability. And I can tell you a story one time. But God will equip that. So we can't say, well, those people, they have a much better skill set. They're much better equipped with the resources or the insights or the talents to do this work, God. Yeah, who's going to listen to me if I say that? None of those things work, because those are our weaknesses. And God says, guess what? I love taking your weaknesses and showing my power through them. So get rid of your excuses. I wore my Guatemala ring this morning to remind me of one of those times when I thought, I can't do this. But I did anyway, and I have some amazing memories, and I learned so much about God and myself and the world. Because, the excuses, I tried them, but they didn't work. So we don't have excuses. But we do have God's grace and God's power. And if we believe that God can and will work in us, God will do amazing things. Some of them will be small, but that's fine, because God doesn't weigh big and small. They're all things that need to be done in God's world. God will do amazing things through us in our weakness if we'll let him. So believe and go knowing that God will do great things through you. And maybe the other people in the sanctuary too, and how cool would that be? Just think of all the stuff that we can share and do, and all the stories and the encouragement that will come if we accept our weakness and God's strength.